Hello everyone, my name is Dan Evans. I'm pleased to be facilitating our discussion today. Thank you for joining us, and let me also thank my co-presenters Lindsay Foley and Tulika Narayan for preparing these slides, inviting me to participate, and with colleagues conducting the cost-benefit analysis that we'll tell you about today as part of the next installment of the CEADIR Discussion Series, Prompting Economic and Livelihood Improvements Through Coastal Mangrove Restoration, a Mozambique case study. This slide presents our agenda for the discussion. After I give some introductory remarks and provide a bit of context for the case study, Lindsay will discuss the methods that the CEADIR team used to value the benefits of mangroves and a gray infrastructure alternative, and Tulika will discuss the benefits that the team uncovered and the key findings. After these presentations, we'll have time to answer questions. By way of an introduction, I served as the Climate Change and Biodiversity Advisor at USAID Mozambique when Lindsay, Tulika, and their team conducted the study that we're going to tell you about today, and I'm very pleased that they invited me to moderate this webinar. As you can read on the slide, I've worked in international development and ecological research for several years. I'm currently working on a couple of different projects, including CR3 Environmental, which is a consulting firm I recently founded to promote sustainable international development through conservation, research, environmental restoration, and climate resilience. Before we dive into the details of this discussion, let me tell you a little bit about CEADIR. CEADIR, which stands for Climate Economic Analysis for Development, Investment, and Resilience, is a USAID-funded $20 million global activity that will be active through March 2019. CEADIR is designed to help governments, the private sector, and civil society make the business and economic case for climate change mitigation and adaptation. To do this, CEADIR mobilizes access to public and private finance in adaptation, clean energy, and sustainable landscapes to scale up low-carbon, climate-resilient development. As a funding mechanism, CEADIR can support activities in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. I also want to note that the cost-benefit analysis report on which our discussion is based today can be found on USAID's Development Experience Clearinghouse. And you can also find the CBA report and some other related files in the references pane on your webinar screen. Now let me provide a bit of background and country context for Mozambique. Mozambique is a beautiful and fascinating country with many environmental challenges. Among other things, it's one of the most vulnerable countries in Africa to climate change. This is for several reasons. Mozambique has a long coastline, approximately 4,500 kilometers along the Indian Ocean, and this coastline is highly vulnerable to cyclones, sea level rise, and associated flooding and erosion. In addition, approximately two-thirds of Mozambique's 29 million people live along the coast. Mozambicans are among the poorest people in the world, and Mozambique's coastal cities, like Quelimane, generally have weak or undeveloped infrastructure and inadequate public services. In part because Mozambique is still so undeveloped, the coastline is rich in naturally occurring mangrove forests that protect against climate-related natural disasters, such as intense storms, flooding, erosion, and landslides. And the mangroves also provide other important ecosystem services like habitat for fish and shellfish. Nonetheless, Mozambicans are degrading or converting mangroves at a rate of about 4% per year. In this context, a few years ago, USAID hired a team of economists and social scientists, including Lindsay and Tulika, from the CEADIR program to conduct a cost-benefit analysis of mangrove restoration to help the agency better understand and quantify the economic arguments for its overall development objective of protecting and restoring mangroves in Mozambique. Okay, USAID uses cost-benefit analysis, or CBA, to strengthen the impact of its work, efficiently and effectively spend appropriations from Congress, and reduce the need for U.S. government assistance over time. USAID also uses CBAs to inform decision makers, including USAID activity managers and local government officials, to help make decisions about budgets and development priorities. The objectives of this CBA were to explore the financial and economic net benefits of mangrove restoration, to inform strategy and management decisions of the USAID Mozambique-funded Coastal City Adaptation Project, which I managed when I was working in Mozambique. So the Coastal City Adaptation Project helped increase climate resilience in 5 Mozambican coastal cities from 2013 to 2018, including in the city of Quelimane, where this study was conducted. And the 22-hectare mangrove restoration work that this CBA focused on was one of CCAP's interventions to reduce flood risks and protect 2 vulnerable, low-income coastal communities in Quelimane. Both of these communities, Isidwa and Mirozane, are close to the coast and bordered by mangroves. At the time of the study, these communities had a combined population of 9,084 people and 1,817 households. These people are very poor. They earn maybe a couple of dollars per day. Like many poor people in developing countries, they are heavily dependent on local natural resources. When people in Isidwa and Mirozane cut mangroves in their neighborhoods, it's often because they want to use the wood as fuel for cooking or make wooden poles for constructing their houses. Importantly, they also collect fish and shellfish from the mangroves. Finally, I should note that the typical houses in Isidwa and Mirozane are small and very simple, made of mangrove poles, rocks, and mud plaster, with a thatch roof and frequently no plumbing. To finish my introduction, let me just refer to this 2015 land use map of the study area, encompassing all of Quelimane and the 2 communities of Isidwa and Mirozane. Again, this area is on the coast of the Indian Ocean. The average tidal fluctuation is 10 to 15 feet. As you can see, the area in green shows that Quelimane still has a fair amount of intact mangrove. But in 2015, Isidwa and Mirozane had mostly degraded mangroves, some agriculture, and especially in Isidwa, increasingly dense housing settlements. The CBA also considered a control area shown on the map in bright green, which still has dense, intact mangroves. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Lindsay Foley, who's the technical lead for sustainable landscapes at CEADIR.
Thank you, Dan, so much for the warm introduction and setting the stage for this study. So as Dan mentioned, CEADIR conducted both financial and economic cost-benefit analyses on 3 scenarios: a without project scenario, a mangrove restoration scenario, and a gray infrastructure scenario. The financial analysis included the market-based benefits to the local government and community, while the economic analysis also included the extra market benefits, including carbon sequestration in the mangrove restoration scenario. Both the financial and economic analysis accounted for the total costs of each option, assuming that the communities incur the costs of the mangrove restoration and the earthen dike construction. Only the financial analysis includes a 17% value-added tax on goods and services, excluding those to the unpaid community labor for mangrove planting. CEADIR estimated annual cash flows for benefits, including revenues and subsidies, as well as costs, including construction, maintenance, and labor, and then calculated annualized net cash flows. The without project scenario, otherwise known as the business as usual scenario, assumes no planned or additional coastal adaptation measures are implemented. The mangrove restoration scenario assumes 22 hectares of elevated riverbank situated between the river and existing infrastructure in the communities. As Dan mentioned, the site was previously a naturally occurring mangrove forest, but because of the informal settlements and pressure to use the mangrove forest, it was completely deforested. So the site has a riverbank and then a relatively barren swath of land that was previously deforested of native mangroves, followed by a dirt road, and then on the other side is the local community where there's a local market, houses, and other structures like meeting places, which, as Dan mentioned, are primarily made of mud and mangrove poles. It's important to note that because local populations modified the land where the study site's located, including more recently for salt panning, the site requires hydrological restoration in order to return it to its natural inundation patterns needed to fully restore the site and ensure the survival of the mangrove seedlings. In the mangrove restoration scenario, 3 species of mangrove seedlings were planted. All are native to the site and were grown by the local community association. The primary species that were used was Avicennia marina, followed by Cereops tagal and Rhizophora mucronata. CEADIR considered a number of gray infrastructure alternatives, including the extension of an existing concrete seawall, which is in the port of Quelimane, just a few hundred meters away. However, after interviewing municipal government officials, we learned that the wall was severely degraded because of a lack of funds in order to maintain it. It was also clear that a concrete seawall option would not be economically feasible because of the high cost of construction combined with the low value of the houses and infrastructure at the study site. Ultimately, the earthen dike option was selected after extensive consultation with the communities and local government. CEADIR engaged experts familiar with building structures in Quelimane and determined that a 5,000-meter earthen dike surrounding the communities of Insidua and Mirazan would be necessary to reduce the flood damage. For such a structure, experts estimated that the expected life of the earthen dike would be about 50 years. The quantification of change in benefit and cost streams is very complex, but particularly so in the dynamic socioeconomic and ecological conditions of the scenarios considered and the site considered. And so the study team must rely on a number of key assumptions. Because these assumptions can significantly change the outcome of the analysis, CEADIR conducted additional sensitivity analyses to look at how the results of the CBA might be impacted by the changes in the underlying assumptions. So first, we adopted a time frame equal to the expected life of the earthen dike, or 50 years, and used the same time horizon for the other scenarios. Recognizing that studies show mangrove species, including those planted in the mangrove restoration scenario, can live to 100 or more years, CEADIR included sensitivity analysis with a project horizon of 100 years as well. For assumptions on the discount rate and study methodology, CEADIR followed USAID's 2015 guidelines, including the use of a 12% discount rate. CEADIR also included sensitivity analyses of 0%, 3%, and 7% discount rates. The CBA used real prices in 2016 US dollars, adjusted using the US Consumer Price Index at an exchange rate of 59 meticais per US dollar, which was the prevailing rate at the time of the study. Quantification of the impact of storms required us to assume the risk and damage of medium and large-scale storms. The risk of storms was estimated using data from Mozambique's National Institute of Disaster Management, which uses historical data to estimate the future probability of storms. For medium-sized storms, which occur once every 3 years, the annual risk is 33%. Likewise, for large-sized storms, which occur once every 60 years, the annual risk is 1.7%. However, the study team recognizes it may not be realistic to assume constant probability or frequency if severe storm risks increase over time due to climate change. However, at the time of the study, no estimates of the potential impact of storms from climate change had been conducted. To estimate the damages from such a storm, the project team based assumptions on the percentage of homes damaged in storm events using data from a 2006 study on the 2004 tsunami that struck Southeast Asia and East Africa, including Kenya and Tanzania. The study assumed in medium-sized storms, 80% of homes or villages would be damaged, and in large-sized storms, 100% would be damaged. To calculate the value of homes destroyed, the study team estimated the average construction cost of houses based on interviews with the local community and inventories of a number of structures within the study site. These houses were made of about 400 mangrove poles each and 31 tin sheets, the average cost of which to purchase locally would have been about $915. When we look at the assumptions for the mangrove restoration scenario, we know that the benefits from mangrove restoration vary with the species density and growth rate. So CEADIR developed growth rates using species composition and interviews with mangroves experts at the University of Eduardo Mondlane in Maputo, Mozambique, who said the mangrove trees would reach full functional maturity and provide ecosystem protection and benefits within 10 years of being planted at a height of 15 meters. Using a Tretton et al. Study in 2015, the study team developed growth estimates including height and percentage of full height. CEADIR assumed benefit streams would accrue at the rate of the percentage of mature height in the bottom row of the table you see here on this slide until they reach 100% maturity in year 10. CEADIR then used mangrove seedling and mature tree survival estimates consistent with CCAP's experience of 80% for seedlings and 95% for mature trees, both assuming that the mangrove restoration site remains protected land by the municipality and that the enforcement costs are covered. CEADIR identified 4 primary financial benefit streams of the mangrove restoration scenario: fish and shellfish production, storm protection, aquaculture, and apiculture or beekeeping, based on interviews with local communities and mangrove experts in Mozambique. CEADIR calculated the financial benefits of each of these benefit streams using a combination of primary data gathered from our study tour and local experts, as well as the use of secondary data, including benefits transfer methodology. For fish and shellfish production, the study team used per hectare fish and shellfish production estimates from a Roanback 1999 study, as well as fish and shellfish price data from local markets and fish production equipment costs, including those for traps and labor, from interviews with the Isidua Local Fisheries Council and local fishermen. Annual net benefits from fish and shellfish production were estimated at over $6,700 per hectare. For storm protection estimates, CEADIR used data again from the 2004 Southeast Asia Tsunami study that showed that in areas with intact mangroves, only 7% of the houses or villages were destroyed. So CEADIR assumed a 7% destruction in medium and large-scale storm events. We also included in the sensitivity analysis assumptions in which homes were not completely destroyed, but rather suffer damage equal to 33% in medium-sized storms or 67% in large-scale storms. For aquaculture, which is done elsewhere in central Mozambique, including for crab and fish fattening, CEADIR used benefit transfer methodology using a Tois et al. Study from 2013, which estimated aquaculture benefits from mangroves at between $5.16 per hectare per year and $370 per hectare per year. CEADIR was conservative and used the low-end estimate of $5.16 per hectare per year for this study. For apiculture, CEADIR applied benefit transfer methodology using data from UNEP's Gazi Bay study in Kenya in 2011, which estimates the annual net income from beekeeping at $15.81 per hectare. This annual net income estimate includes the cost from capital, maintenance, as well as training to local communities on beekeeping. So the table on this slide summarizes the incremental financial benefits from mangrove restoration to the communities after subtracting the net cash flows from the without project scenario. As you can see from the table, total annual financial benefits range from $383 per hectare in year 1 to just over $5,700 per hectare in year 10. This benefit data shows the largest cash flow for mangrove restoration comes from the value of fish and shellfish production, which increases over time as the mangroves mature. The second largest financial benefit stream is from storm damage protection for houses, ranging from $2 per hectare in year 1 to $26 per hectare in year 10. The table shows that apiculture and aquaculture were minor components of the financial benefits of mangrove restoration. So CEADIR also estimated the benefits from carbon sequestered by the mangroves in the mangrove restoration scenario. Since growth curves for all 3 species planted in the study site in Mozambique were not available in the literature, CEADIR estimated a single growth rate based on a 2015 Tretton et al. Analysis that looked at the relationship between tree height in meters and diameter in centimeters for one species of mangroves, Avicennia marina, which is also the main species planted in the study area. So CEADIR estimated the above-ground carbon stock of each tree in each year based on functions from Sitto et al. Study in 2014. It's important to note here that CEADIR did not include the below-ground carbon sequestration, and this was for two reasons. First, because of the wide variance in estimates, which of course vary by hydrological conditions, and second, because of the lack of locally available data in order to estimate below-ground carbon stocks within the mangrove ecosystem. So once CEADIR calculated the above-ground carbon stock per tree, we could calculate the total carbon stock per hectare using the total number of surviving trees per hectare based on the number of plantings and survival estimates. It's important to note that CEADIR did not account for the potential natural recruitment of seedlings, which would likely occur once hydrological restoration is complete and the site's natural inundation patterns are restored. To calculate the value of carbon sequestration in the mangrove restoration scenario, CEADIR applied the per ton price of carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e, to the per hectare estimates of carbon sequestered. CEADIR looked at a number of compliance and voluntary carbon markets to determine appropriate estimate on the price per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, including the northeastern U.S.'s Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, as well as California's Air Resources Board market, and studies of voluntary markets from 2016. You can see that these markets showed a large variation in the carbon value, which ranged anywhere from $2.75 to $99 per ton. Because of this large price variation, CEADIR used 4 different carbon prices in the sensitivity analysis: $0, $8, $15, and $25 per ton. It's also important to note here that the value of carbon was included in the economic analysis portion of the study, but was not included in the financial analysis. And that was because CEADIR assumed it would be difficult for this small remote mangrove restoration project to access markets to sell carbon credits or even meet the monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV, requirements of certification bodies that buyers often require. On this slide, we present the annual economic benefits of carbon sequestration in the mangrove restoration scenario at the 4 carbon values discussed on the previous slide. As one would expect, given the amount of carbon sequestered by mangroves increases as the trees grow over time, so does the value of carbon. Using the highest carbon price, the per hectare economic benefit ranges from $13 in year 1 to over $81,000 in year 10. To calculate the cost of mangrove restoration, CEADIR used CCAP data on their actual costs incurred for mangrove restoration in 2016. These expenditures included the cost of buying seedlings, labor for planting, maintenance, support staff, and hydrological restoration. You can see from the slide that the largest costs were from buying and transporting seedlings as well as planting labor. It's important to note that the hydrological restoration costs here include the cost of removing the previous dams that were constructed for the use of salt pans in order to allow for natural inundation patterns. The labor, material, and equipment costs here come from site-specific quotations provided to the CEADIR team by the CCAP project. Additional annual costs are estimated by CEADIR, including the cost of local labor to protect and enforce the mangrove harvest ban, provide technical assistance for beekeeping, the cost of fishing and aquaculture licenses, fish production costs, as well as taxes. When looking at the gray infrastructure scenario, the primary benefit from the earthen dike is the storm protection it provides to homes. So CEADIR assumes the earthen dike provides full protection to homes in medium-sized storm events, but that during large-scale storm events, the dike would be fully breached, resulting in 100% of homes damaged. Because we assume constant probability of storm risk, the benefits of storm protection are also constant at $153 per hectare per year. So it's important to note that this option does not result in added benefits of fish and shellfish production, aquaculture, apiculture, and carbon sequestration that the mangrove restoration scenario provides. It's also important to note that CEADIR did not value the benefits to human health and safety that either scenario would provide due to a lack of locally available data on the impacts of storms. So to estimate the cost of the earthen dike, CEADIR assumed construction of a 5,000-meter-long dike necessary to reduce flooding in Insidu and Mirazan, and assumed that construction would be completed within the first year. So CEADIR found estimates for the cost of earthen dike construction at between $15 and $55 per linear foot based on a Rogers et al. Study from 2016. CEADIR selected the low-end estimate from this range as most feasible due to both the housing, or primarily due to the low housing values in the study area. So using $15 per linear foot, CEADIR estimated the construction cost for the dike at about $246,000. CEADIR estimated the average annual maintenance cost at 5% of the construction cost based on the experience of Aquapesca, which is a local aquaculture operation experienced in building such structures in Quelimane itself. CEADIR also conducted a sensitivity analysis using the high-end estimate of the construction cost at $55 per linear foot. Experts from Aquapesca informed CEADIR that the repair costs for their earthen dikes were twice the average annual maintenance cost after a medium-sized storm. So you can see from the slide that we assume 10% of capital costs for repair following a medium-sized storm, and we assume that a full rebuild would be required after a large-scale storm event. So the table on this slide presents the incremental financial and economic cost per hectare of the earthen dike alternative for the first 10 years, including construction and routine annual maintenance. As you can see, the per hectare construction costs are the largest expense, costing about $11,000 in the first year. Annual maintenance costs are a consistent $559 per hectare per year, and dike repair after storm events is about $2,200 per hectare per year. Again, assuming that constant probability of storms, which may be unrealistic given the impacts of climate change. Again, the financial analysis includes the cost of taxes, but the economic analysis does not. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague Talika Narayan, who's a PhD economist from Apt Associates working on CEADIR and who led the CBA. Talika joined me on the study site tour and conducting the analysis in order to collect data and interview local stakeholders, and got to trudge through the coastal mangroves of Mozambique with me. Talika will discuss the results and key findings of our study. But before I do, I'd quickly like to share some information about the attendees joining us on the webinar. So far, we have attendees from over 13 countries, including Germany, France, Liberia.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, for the introduction, and thanks for setting up the assumptions so well. And hello to everybody from across the world. It is a real pleasure to present the results of this study, and as Lindsay alluded to, it is a great reminder of the enriching work we did to develop the CBA, the field visits, meeting the communities, the climate vulnerable communities of Isidua and Mirazan who would be impacted by this project, gathering site-specific assumptions, and really getting a full understanding of the context, and which served as a very key piece to understand the most appropriate alternative to consider with respect to mangrove restoration. What is the alternative to adaptation option? So what I will do now, based on with the setting of the stage of all the different assumptions, sort of look at what did we find, what was the net sum of our finding as we look at adaptation options for the most climate vulnerable residents in Quelimane. So if you look at this slide, it's essentially presenting the net present value at the per hectare level of mangrove restoration and earthen dike. It's very clear looking at the two columns that overall mangrove restoration comes out on top as the ideal alternative, whether you consider the financial NPV or the economic. And that's not surprising, because what earthen dike is really doing is providing specifically protection from the storm, and that's valued by the value of houses that were there in these communities. And mangrove restoration on top of that is able to bring in other financial returns by way of fish production, aquaculture, apiculture. And then when you bring in the carbon sequestration value, then the returns increase even further. And you can see the range of returns that we are presenting here. So in the next slide, essentially, we take the per hectare value and just look at the, in aggregate, the total net present value across the 22 hectares of land near Isidua and Mirazan. And again, surprisingly, the story wouldn't change. Whether you look at the total or the annualized value, the earthen dike essentially is outperformed by mangrove restoration. So getting a little bit into understanding where, in what circumstance would earthen dikes sort of turn into a positive net present value, and what's really driving that. And it sort of goes back to what Dan had mentioned right at the beginning, that these areas are essentially poor peri-urban areas in Quelimane with very sort of low-cost housing. I mean, houses often made with mud and poles that are drawn actually from mangroves. So essentially what you're looking at, the earthen dike, which can be set up within 1 year, can provide immediate protection from storm, but the economic value of the property that it's protecting is very small. So mangrove restoration, although provides the protection much later out in the horizon, sort of comes out on top because of all the other benefits that it provides. So I want to dive into that, this element a little bit deeper in the next slide, which talks about the other economic benefits that are not included in the analysis and perhaps what it might do to this comparative assessment of these adaptation options. So as we were, as I mentioned to you, as we went into these communities that are living around these degraded mangrove areas which would be restored, it was clear their houses were very sort of basic, but at the same time there were very clear watermarks on their foot of the houses, you know, running up about 2 feet, indicating clearly that there was flooding. And it's obvious in that times of those flooding that it would have an impact on the quality of their lives. It's not much to extrapolate that it must be affecting their morbidity. There must be disease related to that flooding, and certainly storm surges and such events can be related to mortality also. So if you would consider the human health and safety risk reduction, then this comparative, when does the protection come in for earthen dike, which is very soon within the year, compared to mangrove, which will provide that protection, full protection only 10 years down the line, sort of becomes very germane. And so we were not able to take into account these things because of the scope of the study, but we do present some unit values to give a sense of what that might look like. So the value of statistical life, which is used, you know, for assessing the value of avoided deaths or mortality, is around 96,000 to 300,000, and then just to get a sense of what is the mortality, but you know, impact of these smaller storms is about 9 to 150 deaths were reported in Mozambique. The another aspect that we did not take into account, which would actually put the balance in favor of mangrove restoration, is the option value and the existence value, which is a value that you place on either, which is a use value, but that you do not directly sort of benefit from, but you put value into the fact that other people can benefit from, which is the options value. Or you have valuation for non-use value of simply knowing that there are mangroves that we can restore and protect, and the benefits that result from that. Now within the study, it's also interesting to look at what happens and what's the sensitivity of our result with respect to the various parameters that influence the net present value. We mentioned that we looked at the time horizon of 50 years in the base case scenario. So here in your slide you have base case on the left-hand side and then the low and high sensitivity values that we considered. So what about considering 100 in the high scenario? Because that helps you account for the fact that the earthen dike would have to be repaired or reconstructed, and that would have a recurring cost, while mangroves would not. I just want to point out that we did the sensitivity analysis for all of those 4 discount rates from 0 to 12%, and all of those 4 values of carbon dioxide equivalent. So if you were to look at the report right at the appendix, you'll have a bunch of tables that actually go through all those combinations. But the So going to the third row, around the fourth row, it's talking about mangrove survival after maturity. This is an assumption we made that it is about 95% survival. Now you can wager that that survival will depend a lot on the pressure to sort of on the mangroves, which we know is already pretty high in the Quelimane area. So we consider a lower survival rate, and also for seedling survival rate, we consider a lower survival rate. I did also want to say that the survival rate assumptions are intrinsically tied to the assumptions you make on the cost you incur to reduce those or impact those survival rates. For example, we have about $71 per annum sort of built-in cost to protect the mangroves that are planted. So, when you're designing a project, you can influence some of those factors by understanding, is there a regulation in place that I can rely on? And with the basis of that, I can sort of find some ways to address that. It could even involve community awareness about these issues and the cost incurred in that, which will sort of improve the probability of that. But not surprisingly, that is a very important element, whether your mangroves are going to survive or not in the future, to determine what you'll get out of it. Now, fisheries production, which was by far the largest contributor for NPV, we wanted to consider a lower range to see what that might do. And then for the earthen dike alternative, since the cost is a big driver, the initial cost compared to the returns, we took the lowest value because it seemed appropriate to the region, but we did consider a higher value to see what that would do. And again, this housing value, which impacts the returns for both mangrove and earthen dike, we considered a much higher housing value. Now, before I turn into the slide which sort of talks about the various results from this, I did want to mention that the report also has a switching value analysis. So you might be wondering, is there a point at which the net positive returns become positive or negative, specifically for housing value? So around $7,000 or $8,000 of housing value, do you see like the economic returns from earthen dike going from a negative to a positive? And by the way, we also considered a less conservative damage to houses by saying that what if only 33% of the houses were destroyed in the without project scenario. So if you consider the results for mangrove restoration, in all of those sensitivity scenarios, the financial and economic present value was positive. The ranking of the benefits remained partially the same. And you see a lot of sensitivity of the financial NPV to mangrove survival rate, which is not surprising. But again, in the switching value analysis, you might wonder what kind of seedling and tree survival rate would get you to a negative on mangrove restoration. It's about 15% for financial and 5% for economic. So those seem like really low survival rates, but again, they're not implausible in that region where there is tremendous pressure on these mangroves. And again, not surprisingly, the economic NPV is very sensitive to the carbon prices. Now, the next few bullets, this point about hydrological restoration, this sort of talks about when you're designing or thinking of a project, an adaptation options, and mangrove comes up as an option. An important consideration is the technical feasibility of the option, because hydrological restoration, natural hydrological restoration, which will allow mangroves to thrive, the ebbs and flow of the tide that it needs, is sort of critical to its long-term survival. So without that, there may be just very, very high cost of pumping or so forth to maintain the forest. So that option requires that to be feasible. And again, if there's intense pressure for mangrove conversion, for example, there is economic pressure to just simply convert the land to economic development uses, then that might not be a viable alternative. And then again, we think the site-specific assessment is particularly critical in the context of this hydrological restoration and also understanding the other alternatives. And we made the point about the unquantified ecosystem NPV. Now, key findings in the earthen dike in the study area is again pointing to this piece about full protection in year 1 is what you get from the earthen dike, and in contrast, you get protection from mangroves only in 10 years. And essentially the negative NPV for this earthen dike is driven by relatively high capital costs compared to the low benefits from low-value informal sector housing. And it would be really interesting to do further analysis to understand the economic viability of different options when you account for the human health and safety impacts. So here I am, the overall conclusions. Obviously, the clear conclusions for the community and the area we considered in Quelimane, mangrove restoration comes up as the viable alternative to go with, and that the NPV for both of those options would be higher if you were able to include the avoided mortality and human health impacts from storms. It'd be interesting to see what that relative NPV looks like. And again, emphasizing the deforestation and degradation pressures that influence mangrove when you're considering such a project, and hydrological restoration, which is again critical to understanding the technical feasibility and mangrove survival. And looking ahead, for those of you looking to do this analysis in future, it'd be great to see a sort of emphasis on more site-specific ability to do more site-specific assessment to identify alternatives, and also ability to include extra market benefits that we mentioned. Thanks so much. I guess we're opening it up for questions.
Okay, that was really great. Thank you, Lindsay and Tulika, and thanks to all of you online who've been introducing yourselves and responding to our online polls and sending us questions. We have about 50 people online, really strong interest in this webinar, which is wonderful to see. But unfortunately, we won't be able to take all of the questions. I do have a few here that I'd like to feature. Let's see, the first one comes from Jackie Siles at International Union for Conservation of Nature. And Jackie asks, what are the main gender issues most relevant to this study? I'd like to pose this question to both Lindsay and Tulika.
Thank you, Dan. And that's a really interesting question because when we were on our study tour, a number of key gender issues came to light, primarily through the interviews with the local community members. And I would sort of group the primary gender issues into 4 key buckets. The first is the impact of climate change on agriculture, which is women's primary productive assets. So there are 2 key issues that are happening locally. The first is that saltwater intrusion from storms and inundation and sea level rise is decreasing the productivity and land availability that can be used for agricultural production. And the second is that there is an increasing prevalence of droughts in the region, which are decreasing yields. So in the first scenario around saltwater intrusion, both scenarios, the mangrove restoration scenario and the earthen dike, can help to address some of the saltwater intrusion by decreasing the inundation. In terms of the drought yields decreasing, these really aren't addressed through these 2 scenarios, but it's important to note that agricultural production is women's primary source of income. The second is really around drinking water, and again, saltwater intrusion. We heard stories from local community members about how saltwater intrusion and droughts have both infiltrated local wells, and so it's increased the amount of time and distance that primarily women must have to travel to gather fresh water for their families. And in some cases, we heard that it's up to 6 hours a day. Again, both the mangrove restoration scenario and the earthen dike scenario can help address some of the saltwater intrusion that's coming from the tidal inundation. The third area is really around the mangrove harvest. Because of the deforestation around the communities where the site is located, men are having to travel farther and farther out to harvest mangrove poles and also make charcoal out of mangroves. And we heard anecdotally from community members that men travel for anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks at a time to travel. And so when men have to travel to go farther and farther for the mangrove harvest, that leaves women to bear the burden of feeding and child care and maintaining of the home. And then lastly, I would say are issues around nutrition. So because of the reduction of available agricultural products and fisheries, which have declined both because of the droughts the saltwater intrusion and a reduction in the fisheries due to overfishing. There is decreased nutrition for women and all people in the communities, as well as reduced incomes decrease their purchasing power. So I would say that those are the 4 primary gender issues that the study team came across.
Hi, I mean, this is Sulika here. I mean, Lizzie provided a pretty long list. The only thing that I wanted to add was that one of the things we discussed after those issues came to bear was how could we incorporate that into CBA, and certainly that was a lot of interest, but sort of ended up being out of the scope and resources. But in the discussion session, I have pasted a link to a very interesting study that was commissioned by USAID, which talks about integrating gender in CBA, and there was all this discussion that we had with Conrado Garcia, the economist,
okay, thanks to you both.
Really trying to understand the distribution of the benefits and not just the total benefits, but how do they distribute across
Mr. Robert Navin and Ms. Ruth Metzel. They're curious to know who are the champions for both the analytics and the findings, and how best to justify mangrove conservation to local rural governments.
Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. I wasn't sure who was talking. I would say on the second question around finding champions within the community and how you sell it to the local governments, I think there's immense value in a study like the cost-benefit analysis that we did. And in fact, when we were on our study tour and we were talking to the local governments, they were mentioning the need for these types of studies because of the limited budgetary resources that they have in order to make policy decisions and investment decisions. And so a study like this really provides them with the information needed on not only the impacts to the local communities, but also the costs that arise so that they can make the decisions based on the best available data.
All right, fantastic. Let's take another question. This is a combination question, combination of 2 questions, I should say. This is from Dr. Mark Higgins and Lauren Burnhill. And they ask, can you talk a bit more about how Quelimane could take advantage of and monetize the benefits of mangrove carbon sequestration, perhaps taking advantage of potential mechanisms for climate finance?
That is an interesting question. I guess I would let Lindsay expand a little bit more, who's worked on some of these issues across in CEADIR. And as we mentioned earlier, for this particular study, we determined for such a small area and for the ability to sort of meet all the requirements that would be needed to access the financing,
yeah, I mean,
would not be possible, which is why we sort of put it in the economic benefits aspect of it, but not the financial NPV. But I would invite Lindsay to add any further comments or experience more broadly from CEADIR on this topic.
A rural community in central Mozambique having access to these markets. What I would say is probably that there isn't a whole, that you're probably not going to sell carbon credits into compliance markets. And so one of the key ways that I would suggest that communities like these, if they are interested, would be more the voluntary carbon market route, which often is easier to access. So I would just add that, I think, to what Talika mentioned. But I would also say that there's quite a number of donors who are working in this space, and so you know, the benefits that you can see from the study, even if you use a $0 price per ton of carbon, the economic and financial benefits of the mangrove restoration scenario still outweigh the gray infrastructure alternative. And so I don't think that the carbon price is it's certainly a large benefit, a potential large benefit, but the project like this is still worth going into without that carbon price.
Excellent. That's a really nice summary of some of the challenges of a fairly small restoration project entering or taking advantage of international climate finance. But as you said, nonetheless, the restoration still comes out on top when compared to the gray infrastructure costs and benefits. So let's see. Here we have a more technical question from Kate Snadden. Was there an assessment of the cost and benefits of implementing both mangrove restoration and an earthen dike? And what is the feasibility of doing both? And what would be the consequences?
That's a fascinating question. In fact, thanks for that question, because it's one of the conversations we had of sort of combining the two, because it sort of brings in the early benefits of earthen dike within a year, sort of being able to provide that protection, and then over the long run, you could get returns and have the mangrove, so to speak, take over as the primary way of providing protection. So that was certainly one of the alternatives considered. I think it could be very interesting to do that analysis. We definitely looked into it, but again, this was a study that we were trying to do within the
keeping with another technical question. This is from Moritz Bosman and Serge Ramanantsoa. Forgive me for the pronunciation. The question is, should sea level rise be included in the sensitivity analysis? How might sea level rise affect the value of mangroves for promoting climate resilience in these communities?
So I would say certainly yes, and in fact, when we talk about the storm damage impacts of the study, we again gather that information from INGC, which is the Disaster Management Institute in Mozambique, and to get the estimates of both the storm probability as well as what the medium and large size storms would be categorized as, they take into account scenarios for sea level rise in developing those projections. So the ones that CEADIR used for the study was based on their low-level estimate for sea level rise, and that takes into account data from Beira, which is a town in central Mozambique about 500 kilometers south. And so that data that includes the impact of sea level rise gave us the storm probabilities that were used in this study. INGC also had a high sea level rise scenario, but that scenario from the INGC report results in permanent inundation of both coastal areas and low-lying areas, and the report said that this type of scenario was highly unlikely, so it wasn't one that the project considered. We focused more on the more probabilistic low-level sea level rise scenario, but certainly it's very important to include as a part of the sensitivity analysis for such a study.
And just to end that piece, I wanted to just put a plug in this resource that we have provided today. It's actually the full CBA Excel sheet is available. It's essentially all the workings and all the numbers in the report and what we presented today are available there. And you can see all the different assumptions we made. So this particular detail that Lindsay was describing about the sea level rises, for example, in the climate impact sheet. So I really encourage those of you who are interested in the nitty-gritties of our assumptions, and we would be
terrific.
Really pleased.
Here's a really interesting question that just came in from Dalwei Zhang.
Let's start in any CBA that you're considering.
If the net present value is so high at $33,000 per hectare with a 12% real rate of interest, why was the mangrove restoration not done before?
That's a really interesting question. I guess we did the CBA analysis, which found these results, and I suppose this sort of focuses the attention and the importance of considering different options early and quickly and making that available to policymakers, to key stakeholders, and sort of helping everybody nudge along in addressing adaptation concerns and certainly influencing and mitigating climate change. But that's an interesting question. And yeah, and actually I noted Eric's comment here, but you know, this whole exercise was intended to sort of showcase how CBA can inform policy options. But in reality, on site, the work on the mangrove restoration actually preceded the CBA. This was trying to build a case for conducting a full CBA so that you
Okay,
could
thanks
consider
so much, Talika. I want to finish with one or two, I think we have time for one or two more
Here's what
questions.
The value of this kind of project is. And
this is kind of a more general question about the local context. Mr. Dong Tran wants to know, he says, mangrove restoration takes time. So how can we improve the livelihoods of people in communities like Isidwa and Mirozani in the short term?
I mean, with respect to the improving their lives and livelihoods around protecting them from climate change impacts or protecting them from coastal storms, we are talking about this whole aspect that we mentioned, that an earthen dike or a gray alternative area, maybe in combination with mangrove, would be an interesting option. We noted how we did not consider the quality of life and human health impacts, and perhaps the next step in sort of articulating those and understanding that and being able to make a case for that. But as you may know, there are other projects and efforts that are focusing on their economic development, economic growth, and certainly this project was not sort of focusing on that, but sort of looking at the protection provided from.
One of the challenges that the region was facing that we didn't quite address was coconut lethal yellowing disease, which has taken away incomes from a number of community members who used to work on large plantations in the area. And so that reduction of income opportunity has forced community members to have greater pressure on the mangrove ecosystems, both for deforestation, the use of poles and fuelwood, but also for fishing. And so you're seeing the impacts of that pressure locally. But trying to create other opportunities for income is really important, and we're seeing that in several communities in and around Quelimane. In particular, ecotourism is becoming quite popular in Mozambique, especially in the northern regions. But also aquaculture or beekeeping is something that is beginning to trickle in, and in the short time can yield benefits and can provide some additional sources of income to these communities that otherwise would have less opportunity.
Fantastic. Right. So there are lots of opportunities for development in these communities, and mangrove restoration is one of them, but certainly can't be the only thing that we focus on to improve the lives of the people living there. I think that we are now at time. It looks like we have just 1 minute before we're going to close. So let me just say thanks again to Lindsay, Talika. Thank you both for your excellent presentations, and thanks to everyone online for joining our webinar today.